The wonder is you can start with nothing and end with nothing and lose so much in between. Welcome to AMI Audiobook Review, the weekly podcast where we chat all things audiobooks with me, your host, Ramya Amuddin. We picked a quote. Well, actually, I should take zero credit for this. This quote was picked by Aamer Khan, and it's from Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And this book will be featured in a second when we get together with Aamer Khan and talk about his book picks of the month. Why not? But let's get quickly to the CELA homepage. If you go to the Center for Equitable Library Access via their website, celalibrary.ca, you will find 3 featured titles. They are still The Whispers by Ashley Audrain, and this is a suspense and thrillers we're going to chat about next week, so we're finally almost there with that chat. We also have The Wager by David Graham, and this is a history. And the final title up there is The Misses by E.L. James, which is a romance. On today's episode, like I said, we're going to be checking in with Aamer Khan. He's got some Pulitzer Prize winners that he wants us to go through, so we'll find out what he's thought about them. Let's check in with Aamer Khan on AMI Audiobook Review. It is the last episode of the month, and Aamer, the audiobook worm, is here to give us a brief of how the reading has been going this month. And the theme, because there is a theme at the end of the month usually, is Pulitzer Prize winners. So, Aamer, before we get into the actual books that you chose, because there are 3 books we want to highlight, you want to tell us a little bit about the Pulitzer Prize and the origins behind it. Was it interesting?
It was. I mean, I think it's something that we've all heard about quite a bit and in different sort of forms and ways. So I wanted to just get like sort of a baseline as to what this prize is and where it sort of came from. And the history of it is not all that long. So I wanted to let people know what it is because I found it interesting. Joseph Pulitzer was actually a immigrant from Hungary who landed in St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States in the I believe the early 1900s or so, and he basically started working at a newspaper, then ended up owning the newspaper, then ended up owning several newspapers throughout the United States. So a real sort of American dream story come to life. In his passing and in his will, he basically stipulated that this prize should be set up. Originally, it was a prize for journalism, which it still is. There are still Pulitzer Prizes for journalism. Joseph Pulitzer also founded the Columbia School of Journalism, which is where the board sits for the Pulitzer Prize. And every year they go through, I think, 23 categories, everything from journalism to fiction to nonfiction. The categories have sort of changed since just before the 1920s to now. But I think most famous, the prize is for journalism and for fiction. So I decided to take a look at some of the more recent winners of the Pulitzer Prize in the fiction category.
Okay. Well, first of all, this is kind of wild, the amount that it's grown, but I mean, in a significant amount of time as well, right? So it's not like it's just happened overnight. But I do think that it's got lots of recognition now, obviously, but it's nice to see that it's expanded from just journalism into all kinds of writing. Now, the 3 books that you picked for today that you want to highlight, is there a running theme? Is there a chain that kind of links these together?
Yeah, I mean, I found them very similar. They're very different topics, but I think for the most part, with especially these 3 books, there's a certain melancholy, certain amount of sadness, but there's a significant amount of hope in these books too. Each of these books sort of examines a important period in history, and important events of that particular time that it's set in. So I found that great. I mean, the other thing that really sets Pulitzer Prize winning sort of fiction apart from others is just the author's ability to paint a picture in a concise number of words, right? I mean, like, they're not using a whole lot of words, but they're saying so much in those few words that it really makes readers think as well as paint the picture. And the sort of other piece that I found that really ties a lot of this together is just the reading level. You and I have talked a little bit more about young adult and how much how popular it's become in terms of a genre. This is more on the adult side of young adult, so older young adult. But I feel like any of these three books could be used in sort of a grade 11, grade 12, sort of a high school level learning. I
Mm.
think the Underground Railroad by Colson Whiten is actually used in school to teach a bit about the Underground Railroad. Um, so yeah.
I mean, I'm curious about the three books, of course, but I'm also curious about your take on the recognition of something being a Pulitzer Prize winner. With these books, like with the fiction that you've chosen, do you find that you're uh, critiquing the recognition through the accolades of Pulitzer Prize winning?
I think from my own personal perspective, when I start the book and I know that it's a prize winner, I'm looking for a
Hmm.
certain writing quality,
Okay, yep.
and I'm looking for a certain profoundness in the books, which all three of these definitely have. Um, there's the nature of the prize is kind of the effect it has on society. It's interesting from the when I was looking at the actual prize that there were some people when it first came out that thought it was a sort of self-congratulatory piece
Mm,
for journalism rather than an actual award that was merited. Obviously, that has changed over time, and it is very prized, and people do feel that these awards are merited. A lot of these three books also have other awards that, in addition to the Pulitzer. So it's always sort of a good sign when books have more than one award,
yep.
and you're always looking for something that sets them apart from other books. And I think that's the sort of lens I look at it when I start reading this book. Like, okay, why am I reading this book as opposed to other books, and what's the
Mm,
difference?
yeah. I mean, definitely, it's not just like the review process. It's not like a publicly acclaimed or anything like that. There's something more, there's more depth that we're looking for, right? And when you say writing quality, we're not just talking about style either. We're talking about the actual significance of the contents of the book. So that's quite deep.
Yeah, substance and observation as well. I think
Mm,
that's the other piece that sets these three apart from, just an average book as well, is that the authors have a certain perception and a way of telling the reader about observations of humanity that is not easy to do. I mean, you can pick up a popular author, and there's some elements of that typically with very popular authors, but usually not to this depth and breadth.
right, right. Okay. So then let's get right into the examples. What's the first one you want to mention?
A Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This was my first book by this particular author. This was actually recommended to me by someone, and they said it was great. It was a Pulitzer Prize winner, and I wasn't sure what it was about, so I took a quick look at the synopsis, and it, it's hard to describe the book without giving too much away. But the gist of the novel is following the story of a young boy who grows up in sort of trailer and tragedy in poverty in West Virginia. So it's a very, set in America type of story. West Virginia is known for coal mining, or was known for coal mining many years ago, and it's the story of a boy who is growing up in the aftermath of this particular boom, and how even through a lot of adversity, there's a very healthy level of optimism in him to succeed.
So when you were reading this book, did it feel very unfamiliar? The situations, the circumstances that you were reading about?
No, I mean, it's a standard story of struggle and strife in a lot of ways. It's very well written in terms of the way that things are observed. For all three of these novels, you have these concepts of nature versus nurture. You also have the concept of perhaps the government is not always in the best interest of the people, even though from a United States perspective, the government is supposed to be for the people, of the people. Not to say that these are conspiracy theory books by any stretch of the imagination, but I think the authors in all three of these books have a well balanced approach to say that not everybody is perfect, including the government.
I know that when we read things that feel like we can analyze like the struggle itself or the circumstance that's being, broadly put to us, right? And that kind of thing is easier to analyze. But when it comes down to like the depth of the emotional, did you feel like it was done very well?
Yes, for all
Yeah.
three books. I mean, you really feel like you're in the characters' shoes. You're really feeling their pain, their elation. For a lot of these three books, they're sort of
Mm,
living the American dream or the exception to the rule. Would be a better way of putting it. And you're really cheering the characters on.
right.
And all three of these books sort of follow the life and also delve into sort of the origins from before as well, in terms of history of these characters, which I think is very telling in terms of why the characters are the way they are.
What was one of the, because it seems like there were a lot of different themes of resilience being explored here just because of the character and everything that they were going through. Was there one particular theme that really stood out to you?
There was, but I don't want to give it away. So
Uh
I'll,
Spoilers?
yeah,
Okay.
and I think that's one of the really interesting parts of reading this book is that you don't know really where it's going, but when it reveals itself, it totally
Mm,
makes sense. I will say that there is the concept of the foster system or the Department of Children Services
mm-hmm.
that is prevalent in the beginning part of the book. His mother is, struggles with addiction, and you can see how that has sort of shaped him and his life and his uh, outlook on things from an early age.
I think addiction is something that's it's terribly difficult to explore as the theme because we come with so many biases already about the subject, right? So we're going into it, I maybe defensive. A lot of the times, our own judgment really just gets in the way. So, would you say in this book, and we can talk about the other two books as well, but in this book, were you being challenged on a lot of your own preconceived notions? Doesn't have to be about the addiction portion, but in general, that's
I
also
don't
another
think
powerful
so.
theme.
Me personally, a lot of the items that were explored in the book, they weren't surprises to me. The more interesting part in terms of themes was also the concept of rural versus city life or urban living. So this book takes place in like the here and now. So again, this is a 2023 prize winner, and the book pretty much takes place uh, in our time in terms of cell phones and all that. So it's not going back, into the 1950s or something like that. So even in today's world, it was really interesting to see how the author explores that concept of rural living in terms of West Virginia in a small town versus somebody who's never seen a city walking into one, and what that's like.
Okay, well, interesting. Let's get to the second book too, then, so we can start looping in the kinds of things that were explored with the other two books. What's the second one?
The second book is called The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. Just before we get into that, I just wanted to
Yeah.
comment about something from the previous book, and it's one of the terms the author uses when the main character sees apartment buildings for the first time. And of course, he's coming from rural, Virginia, where everybody grows up in a trailer and has a little strip of land,
Mm.
and he coins the apartments doom castles, and I thought that was really great. In terms of how do you get out, how do you say hello to your neighbor, how do you know thousands of people,
Mm.
and say hello, where in his world that's the way you live. You know who your neighbors are, and you talk to them, and if you need to get out, you can get out quickly. um, yeah.
And it's not like that everywhere.
No.
Definitely. Okay, so you were saying,
Yeah, so Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, as the name implies, it's about the Underground Railroad, and it goes back to that particular time of slavery, and that sort of in between time where northern states, some states had slavery things on their books, and of course in the Deep South, they did not, in terms of people being free. So it traces uh, sort of the origins of slavery in the United States, from Africa to plantations. In this particular case, our main character is on a cotton farm. The concept of, I think, the military-industrial complex has been talked about a lot, especially in reference to the Second World War. But in this particular book, they're looking at a different sort of industrial complex, which is more agricultural complex than anything else in terms of how the cotton industry sort of fueled the slave industry of the time, and how difficult that was to change. So you had all these, sort of things being explained in the book, which I think was explained very, very well. You also had the concept of even if you escaped, you didn't escape, or uh, weren't exactly free until you crossed the border into
Right.
Canada. So that was something I didn't know personally, was that even in northern states, if you came to somewhere like New York or Virginia, if you were property of a plantation or something, the plantation owners could actually hire, um, I guess they call them slave catchers, to basically find runaways and bring them back. And these states had laws on their books where this was actually lawful. Um, so to the point where I believe, in historical terms, there were some cases where it were tried in Canada in terms of bringing people back to their plantations, but I don't
Hmm.
think those were successful. But again, I'm not an expert in the field by any means.
And that wasn't brought up in the book itself.
No, I mean the concept
Okay.
of getting to Canada, and that
Right.
was the safe zone, was definitely something that was brought up in the book, and there were places along the way like South Carolina and some other places which are mentioned in the book where people had to make a hard choice in terms of, things looked good in terms of, you could get a job, you were free. Did you really want to take a chance and keep going north, because even
Hmm.
traveling was very risky at that time. Um,
Tell me what perspective this book was written in. Whose perspective?
so for all of these books, they were written in a few different perspectives. The main character for this book is a young woman who tries to escape. The story of her is that her mother actually was the only one to successfully escape the plantation that she was on.
Mm.
Nobody knew where she went or how, what happened to her, or whatever. But I mean, um, others had tried to escape and were punished severely for leaving, and were brought back and essentially tortured and killed. And the book does a lot of description in terms of what living on a plantation was like as a slave. And obviously the conditions were horrific. And that's it's not a book for everybody. But at the same time, it's something worth reading in terms of how people lived, how people got through these particular times, and the types of things that went on in terms of not only of bringing slaves from Africa, but also basically selling slaves that were basically children, um,
Mm.
from these plantations as well.
I mean, when you think about like how many people are coming into reading a book like this with potentially little to no idea on the subject versus people who might have a ton of idea and are looking for, validation, confirmation, for research purposes, that kind of thing. You're really catering to like a vast array of audience, right?
Yeah, definitely you are. I think there is one misconception here. Again, I am not an expert by any means in this particular time in history, but
Mm-hmm.
the book does talk about an actual railroad that is taking people north, secretly. From what I know from my school studies, I mean the Underground Railroad is more of a network of people bringing people north rather than an actual train and that sort of thing taking people north.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because a few weeks ago they had the Emancipation Ride from the TTC, which was actually on a train,
Mm-hmm.
um, to mark the Underground Railroad. So
In Toronto, yeah.
in Toronto, and I think we have this concept of a train bringing people north from the south, which is not entirely accurate.
No. And that's when we have to kind of um, dig a little deeper, right? Either during these reads or right after, because we are talking about fiction in essence, and that's not always just limited to like the character and the character story. Sometimes we're talking about things that we could truly misconstrue as fact, from history. So
Absolutely, and
yeah.
and I think the author does a great job of not glorifying some parts of this particular history. I mean,
Okay.
that even the train that is described for taking people north is not described as some sort of luxury railroad.
Right.
It's described as people, hiding in the coals, or hiding in very uncomfortable places, just
Mm,
to see where to go, and the concept of whether there would even be anybody on the other side or whether you'd be captured. Um, with a lot of these sorts of periods in history where you have uh, almost like a governmental uh, system or apparatus for keeping or oppressing a particular people. You have this whole concept of people who are uh, informers or traitors, and it gives you a sense of the paranoia and the level of fear
of
um,
course.
that was prevalent, even when you were the uh, on the plantation or on these farms,
Hmm.
even if you weren't escaping.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's like it, for obvious reasons, it feels like a lose-lose situation, right? You don't know what you're getting into, but it doesn't mean that what you know is better. Very tough. One more book. Sorry, that sounded kind of abrupt, but one more book we want to feature before we gotta get out of here.
Sure. The Night Watchman is the last book by Louise Eldridge, I think is how you pronounce her name. She actually narrated her own book. By the way, all three of these books are human narrated on Sela, and all three of the narrators are absolutely fantastic.
Mm.
A lot of the quotes which I've enjoyed from these books, I'd like to write them down, and reading them back with Jaws, it's just not the same at all. So I did want to put that shout out that all three narrated. The book narrators were amazing for all three
Mm-hmm.
of these books. The Night Watchman is an indigenous fiction book. It is the story of as the name implies, a night watchman from the Turtle Mountains in North Dakota. This is set in the 1950s in the United States. And the story centers around um, a bill that was put in Congress that basically was designed to terminate the indigenous population of the Turtle Mountains in terms of First Nations peoples. Um, so the book is a lot about how the people of the Turtle Mountains lived and worked with each other, the level of poverty that they had, but the level of pride they had on their land as well, and basically how, especially this night watchman, went to D.C. basically to oppose this particular bill.
Yeah, I think like for all three of these books, honestly, you're navigating and are able to get a very zoomed in picture of characters representing particular communities, right, in particular times of history. And that is, I think, hard to do well, which is why taking it back to the recognition, the Pulitzer Prize, that is important to kind of like understand why these books get the recognition that they do, because they do it this way, and put you in a place of not just interest, but of real belief of the things that people are facing, even though these are fiction books that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think especially for this book, it really highlights the concept of how little choice you have between a bad choice and a worse choice.
Right.
And what,
Two evils.
yeah, the decision between two evils, as well as how do you deal with that?
Mm,
How do you live, and how do you be continually optimistic when you're faced with these sort of challenges? The concept of indigenous women and how they are treated is definitely um, in this book. You have concepts of misconceptions even in the 1950s. You have one sort of non-indigenous teacher that teaches at the school, and there's a conversation between him and the sort of elder who is leading this charge against the this bill, and he's asking like, don't you want to be a U.S. citizen? And the elder's like, we've been a U.S. citizen since, forever. That has nothing to do with this bill. And he's like, what? You guys can vote? And he's like, yes, after women and others, we were given the right to vote as well. So it was interesting to me to see this sort of misconception from this particular person, even though he's living with them and doesn't know about them.
So fantastic. I'm glad that we got to talk through these 3 books. It feels like we didn't have enough time though, but we do have to wrap, and we'll check in with you next month. As always, thank you, Aamer.
You're very welcome.
We were checking in with Aamer Khan, as we usually do at the end of the month. I'm your host for AMI Audiobook Review, Ramia Amuddin, with technical producer Nisreen Abdelmajid. And starting season 3 next week, coming with some brand new upgrades for the pod and the show. We have somebody new joining the team, and you'll hear from that person and us next week when we get started. This is AMI Audiobook Review, and until next time, until season 3, brand new refresher, happy audiobook listening.